Hey everybody, we are live. Let's see who's here. How's everybody doing? All right. Jacob says, oh hi. Ed and Dina bless. So excited to hear what Pastor Sam has to say on this verse. Yeah, we'll see. We'll see how it goes, Ed and Dina. Oh my goodness. We have a celebrity, everybody. Miss Anaya Serrano is here. Anaya has been like an OG diehard Theology Thursday fan from day one, and she is my personal favorite fan. Sorry to everybody else. So awesome to have you here, Anaya. Anaya actually has some plans for things that she could say on Theology Thursday, so one of these days we're going to make that happen because I don't want to spoil it for you, but she has really, really good soteriology, and that's what she wants to talk about. So hopefully at some point we can make that happen. Thanks for being here, Anaya. The mysterious CG is still here. Great to see you. Alice, Ruth, Robert, Jill. Thank you guys all so much for being here. So cool. I know I say this every week, but it's so awesome to jump on here and see all of you and see all of your names and be able to talk to you guys in person. Well, not in person, but in real time like this. So thank you for being here. This is another kind of one-off special week. We're going to do a verse deep dive. That's, the silly name I came up with just for these kind of opportunities we have, because I think we'll do them, from time to time, where we take a verse that's either popular or misunderstood or super difficult and just spend the entire time trying to understand it correctly. So this is what we're doing this week, and next week we'll start our apologetics series. And so I'm going to give you some more information about that at the end. So stick around for that for sure, if for nothing else. So again, thanks for being here. How's everybody doing? Hope you guys are hanging in there. If you're new to this, feel free to, hey, there's Jim and Julie Hansen. Feel free to jump in the chat and say hello. And as I always say, as we go along, I really welcome not just questions, but also comments or thoughts. If I say something that sparks a thought in you that you'd like to share, type it into the chat there. If you're on your computer, it should be on the right-hand side of the video. And if you're on your phone, I think you might have to turn your phone a different way to see it. But yeah, love to have your thoughts and questions. So Robert Bengal says, if only in person. I could not agree with you more. And we cannot wait for that day to come. And so today we're, taking a big swing here, looking at Jeremiah 29:11. This is a verse that is just beloved by Christians, hugely popular. And I want to say the same thing I said last week when we talked about Revelation 3:20, which is things like this have a real danger, and it's a danger I want to avoid. And that is, this is not just an opportunity to be snobby. It's not just an opportunity to be nitpicky and to say like, oh, that's your favorite verse, but actually you're wrong. That's the last thing we want to do. We want to understand these verses correctly because we are convinced as Christians that the true understanding of a verse is better than the false one, or the slightly incorrect one, or maybe the slightly misdirected one. The truest understanding is always going to be the best one 100% of the time. And we trust God, we trust His Word, and so we say, hey, we want to know what it actually means. And so that's what tonight is about. It's not about saying, we're just going to be cooler than everybody who uses this verse wrong. Because frankly, and this is, the caveat that I want to give at the top of this one also, chances are if you've been a Christian for more than a year, you have used this verse. You might love it. You might have it memorized. You might have it tattooed on you. You might have it on a mug or a piece of art in your house. And so please, please, please do not beat yourself up if anything tonight starts to make you feel a little bit insecure about the way you may have used this verse in the past. That's, again, the last thing I want to do. And I think you'll see that my opinion of this is different than you might be thinking. I'm not just going to come out here and say Jeremiah 29:11 isn't for you. But anyway, I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's take a look at it. And we're going to put it in the NIV because the NIV is the version that is the most commonly memorized, quoted, and put on, coffee mugs and reusable grocery bags and stuff like that. Here it is. Jeremiah 29:11 in the NIV. For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you hope and a future. So again, many of you, this is probably the version that you've got. Hey, Taya's here. Glad you made it, Matea. Good to see you. It's like it's never quite right until Matea shows up, so I'm glad you're here. And so, again, I know I don't want to be beating a dead horse here, but we're in a time right now where we are desperate to know that God has a plan, to believe that God has the best in mind for us in the future. So again, my goal is not to take away from that. I just want to do the work of understanding what this verse really means. And then we all are going to take some time to talk about, what does the Bible say about God's plans for us? And so here's the question that we have to answer tonight. At the simplest level, does this verse apply to Christians? And my answer is, well, sort of. It's complicated. But complicated is what we do on Thursday nights. So let's dive in. There are two versions of how this verse is used commonly that both have some problems. And again, it's likely that you've run into or used it in one or both of these ways. The first one is kind of like the light version. This is the most common thing. And that's using this verse as an encouragement for something difficult in your life or someone else's life. So it could be everything from like real, genuine suffering and pain to just like a bad day or an unmet expectation or like a dream that doesn't seem to be coming true. And so, really hard situation, kind of hard situation, not that big of a deal situation. We're quick as Christians to throw this verse out and say, hey, God knows the plans he has for you, and his plans are to prosper you and not to harm you. And so in any of those cases, it's fundamentally the same thing. It's like, don't let life get you down. God has plans for you. And so that means that this situation is going to turn out fine. And that's the key, is it's taking this verse and saying, hey, you're in a hard situation right now, but God has plans for you to prosper you and not to harm you. So this situation is going to be fine. That's kind of fundamentally what the problem is. Now, version 2 is more dangerous, and it puts more emphasis on this word prosper, specifically the English word prosper. And this is not one that I expect as many people watching right now struggle with, so I'll be brief. But the teaching goes that Jesus on the cross did not just secure for you spiritual salvation, but also a guarantee of physical and material prosperity and kind of salvation from physical suffering. And so the use of this verse in that situation goes something like, hey, if you are suffering right now, you just have to have enough faith that this prosperity that God promised is coming right now, because that's what God promises in Jeremiah 29:11 and places like that. And so that version is way stronger and way more dangerous, but they're both kind of a similar thing. And it's almost like the law of attraction for Christians. You guys familiar with the law of attraction? The law of attraction is this thing that's taught in books like The Secret and other things that basically says, like, if you kind of believe that you have the thing that you want, then the universe will bring it to you. And Jeremiah 29:11 can turn into the law of attraction for Christians. Hey, God has promised that he has plans to prosper you and not to harm you. So you just have to have enough faith in that, and God will bring that thing your way. Now, there's a third way of misusing this verse or mistreating this verse. And I'm actually, I suspect to some extent that people who watch Theology Thursday might have a higher propensity to struggle with this one. And that's saying, hey, Jeremiah 29:11 is not about you. And then if somebody were to ask you a follow-up question like, well, why not? If you're honest with yourself, you realize, I actually don't know why. I just know I'm not supposed to use Jeremiah 29:11. You know what I mean? So, guilty is charged, some of us. And again, give yourself a break. But it's very possible that you're one of those folks who you kind of know that Jeremiah 29:11 isn't being used correctly when people use it in those other two ways, but you don't really know why. And so the solution to all of those is to understand Jeremiah 29:11 in its full context. And that means understanding Jeremiah 29:11 in the context of the rest of the book of Jeremiah, and then understanding the rest of the book of Jeremiah in the context of the story of Israel, and then understanding the story of Israel in the context of all of God's salvific plan and how we fit into it. That's the only way to really get to the bottom of what Jeremiah 29:11 means to us. And so let's look at it again. It starts with for. And if you've been here since the hermeneutic series, you know that if you see a therefore or a for at the beginning of a verse, the first thing you do is look at what came before it. Because when a biblical author says for or therefore, they're saying something that's dependent on the thing that they just said. So step one is always to zoom out. That's a reminder from our hermeneutics lesson. If a verse is confusing, the very first thing you do is just zoom out and look at the bigger picture. So let's look at Jeremiah 29:10. because we're going to see right off the bat, it's not as simple as God's going to make your situation a little bit better. 4, you notice right away, Jeremiah 29:10 also starts with 4. For thus says Yahweh, when 70 years are completed for Babylon, I will visit you, and I will fulfill to you my promise and bring you back to this place. And then it goes into, for I know the plans I have for you, and Jeremiah 29:11 starts. So right off the bat, if you have a critical eye, you go, this looks like a pretty historically specific situation. There's something about 70 years. God says he's going to bring some of them back to this place, whatever place he's talking about. We don't really know, but it sounds specific, and it should immediately cast doubt upon the idea that this verse can be kind of universally applied to Christians across the board. And like I said, you notice verse 10 also starts with 4. And if you zoom back, you'll notice verse 9 also starts with 4, and verse 8 also starts with 4. So to actually get what's going on, we have to look beyond just verse 10, 11, and 12, and look at what's happening in this whole chapter, and it'll give us a clue. So let's start at the beginning of Jeremiah 29. If you have a Bible and it's easier for you to just kind of look there rather than read this, you can feel free, of course, to do that. Hopefully the font is big enough for you guys. Let me know if it's not. So we're in the middle of the book of Jeremiah, and chapter 29 starts with this. These are the words of the letter that Jeremiah the prophet sent from Jerusalem. So that's what here is, Jerusalem, to the surviving elders of the exiles, and to the priests and the prophets and all the people whom Nebuchadnezzar had taken into exile from Jerusalem to Babylon. Okay, that is, by the way, amazingly helpful and amazingly clear. It doesn't always turn out that easy when you're trying to understand what's going on in a prophetic book. But right there at the beginning of this very chapter, we find out who's talking, where they are, and who they're talking to. And so what we learned there is Jeremiah is a prophet who is still in Jerusalem after the exile to Babylon has taken place. And he's writing a letter from Jerusalem with a prophetic word from God and sending it away to the exiles who were in Babylon. Now, let me just give you like the incredibly overly brief version of what like Jeremiah's story is and how this section fits into that. And I apologize in advance. Some of this I don't have time to fully unpack, so it might be a little confusing if you're not familiar with this time period in biblical history, but I'll try to be quick. Now, Jeremiah is one of my favorite characters in the entire Old Testament. He's also probably, this is a competitive field, but he's probably the most mistreated prophet in the entire Bible. I mean, he is just, he has a ministry that goes on for decades and decades, and no one, and I mean no one, listens to this guy. We have one character who's on Jeremiah's side, one human character. God is on Jeremiah's side, but we have one human character, his scribe Baruch, who actually seems to be on Jeremiah's team. Other than that, we don't read about a single person caring about him or responding positively to his messages. And not only that, but he gets mistreated. I mean, decades-long ministry, and his message to Jerusalem, to Israel, to the leaders of Israel, is almost, Jacob Serpa says, weepy boy. He's being sarcastic, but the reason he says that is because Jeremiah's title that he's known by is the weeping prophet, because Jeremiah's ministry is so brutal and sad. I don't personally like the term weeping prophet because it makes Jeremiah sound weak, and he is not, but he does absolutely suffer. And so Jeremiah's message to Israel is consistently like scathing judgment about their sin and their rebellion. He tells them messages from God that start before the exile and basically say, warning after warning of, hey, you need to get your act together. You need to keep up your end of the covenant that you made with God. You need to stop the idolatry. You need to care for the widow and the needy. You need to be faithful to God, because if you don't, God is going to do what he said he'd do, which is remove you from this place and send you to exile. And so no one listens to him. He's ignored, mistreated. He's humiliated. At one point, he's thrown into a cistern that was used as a prison, publicly beaten, and just treated horribly. And then, lo and behold, what he said would happen happens. And during Jeremiah's ministry, Nebuchadnezzar comes from Babylon, the king of Babylon, and sacks Israel, destroys the temple, and takes the people of Jerusalem away into exile. And you would think that kind of like tragic vindication of Jeremiah's message would cause people to listen to him, but it doesn't. He continues to be almost entirely ignored and mistreated for the rest of the story too. So that post-exile time frame is where Jeremiah 29 happens. The majority of Israelites have been taken from Jerusalem to Babylon, and there are some people left in Israel. Jeremiah is one of the people who's still back in Jerusalem. And so while he's there, and the people who are in exile are in Babylon, Jeremiah writes them a letter with a message from God. And so that's what we have recorded in Jeremiah 29. And so during that time, something starts to happen. And we read about this in Jeremiah and in other prophets. Some of the people who call themselves prophets, who are with the exiled Israelites, start to say things that they say are messages from God that aren't from God. And basically, they're making false promises. They start telling people things like, hey, don't get too comfortable here because God's about to rescue us any day. God's coming to save us, and he's going to take us out of here and bring us back home, and it's going to happen soon. So, keep your bags packed, basically. Keep your shoes on, keep your bags packed. We're getting out of here. In fact, you can see this is implied in verses 8 and 9 here, right before Jeremiah 29:10, or 11 rather. So here's the message. We'll start at 4, actually. Thus says Yahweh of hosts, the God of Israel, to all the exiles whom I have sent into exile from Jerusalem to Babylon. So there's that story, right? This is the message. Build houses and live in them. Plant gardens and eat their produce. Take wives and have sons and daughters. Take wives for your sons and give your daughters in marriage, that they may bear sons and daughters. Multiply there and do not decrease, but seek the welfare of the city where I have sent you into exile. Seek the welfare of Babylon. And pray to Yahweh on its behalf, for in its welfare you will find your welfare. Now listen to this. For thus says Yahweh of hosts, the God of Israel, do not let your prophets and your diviners who are among you deceive you, and do not listen to the dreams that they dream. For it is a lie that they are prophesying to you in my name. I did not send them, declares the Lord. These are the people who are saying, keep your bags packed, we're almost out of here. He says, don't listen to them. I didn't send them. And then immediately after that, he says, for thus says Yahweh, when 70 years are completed for Babylon, I will visit you, and I will fulfill to you my promise and bring you back to this place, Jerusalem. For I know the plans I have for you, declares Yahweh, plans for welfare and not for evil, to give you a future and a hope. Okay, hopefully that helps, and hopefully that wasn't too confusing of a fire hose of historical and contextual information. But this is the point, and this is what's so amazing about this, is that in context, Jeremiah's message is exactly the opposite of how we usually use this verse. I shouldn't say exactly the opposite, but it's very, very different. It's hard to imagine it being more different. It's not a message of, hey, I know you're struggling now, but God's about to save you, so keep your chin up. There are false prophets saying that. Jeremiah, the true prophet, comes in and says, don't listen to them. This isn't going to be over anytime soon. Put down roots. He says, hunker down. There are decades of exile left for you, 70 years. But in the midst of that suffering, God is promising his people that they will endure this, that it won't last forever, and that God's will for them is still good. It's still for their good. And he has not abandoned them. He hasn't left them there alone. They're going to get out. They're going to be free. And so think about this for a second. And keep in the back of your mind, the common misuses of Jeremiah 29:11 that we've been talking about. God's promise that he's giving Israel here is not going to happen in the lifetime of almost anyone who hears this letter the first time it's read. So if you are let's say you're young, you're a 25-year-old Israelite who's there in exile, and you hear Jeremiah's letter, do you think that in the ancient Near East you're going to live to be 95 and be one of the people who gets out of there? No way. It's not impossible, but it was extremely uncommon in that time and place. And so that's a message that's coming straight to them from God. And the message is, by the time you get out of here, most of you will be dead, and it'll be your children who are rescued. Now, here's the thing. That sounds really depressing, and I said it that way on purpose to us as modern Western people. But this is a promise that would have been a much greater encouragement to the original hearers than most of us today realize. And that's for a combination of translation problems in the NIV and cultural distance. And so let's dig in and look at both of those things. Oh, but before we do, couple of questions. Alice Chase says, we're going to be in COVID for 70 years. Yikes. I don't think so. No, I sure don't think so. Thankfully, I'm not one of those Bible interpreters who does that and says, hey, 70 years, so it must be 70 years. And, if we wanted to be depressing, we could find some much bigger numbers than that in the Bible. Ellen asks, why were some left in Jerusalem? Great question. The short version of that, this doesn't really apply to Jeremiah, but the general approach was, when Nebuchadnezzar chose his exiles, and he actually did it multiple times. It wasn't all at once. There was 3 different deportations of exiles from Jerusalem that happened. And basically what he was trying to do is take the most useful people and kind of the most impressive people. So it's people like Daniel and his friends, especially in the first wave. It's like, let's take all of these people who we can kind of brainwash and put to good use. So people who are strong, people who are smart, and stuff like that. By the end, they're taking the majority of people, but they leave some people there to kind of tend the land and for a variety of other reasons. But it's a small percentage of people and predominantly poor people who were left in Jerusalem. And you kind of see the outcome of that when you read books like Ezra and Nehemiah. When God's promise to Jeremiah does come true, and 70 years later they get to leave, they come back and there's drama with the people who have been there for those 70 years. So yeah, and a similar, different kingdoms did that for different reasons. When the northern kingdom is exiled, which happened 100 years earlier, the northern kingdom of what was called Israel or Ephraim, they remove them from Samaria, and that happens from a different nation. That's Syria, that's not Babylon. And what their practice was is they would intentionally intermingle different people groups with the conquered people to kind of defuse and water down their cultural distinctiveness. And that's where the Samaritans came from. Great question. So again, what I was saying before that is that it's this message that, hey, you're not even in your lifetime, you're not going to get out of here. So, hunker down, build a house, seek the prosperity and the good of that city that you're in. But that's not as discouraging of a message as it sounds. And like I said before, that's translation related and cultural distance related. So one more time with this NIV translation, which I want to say this up front, because I'm going to pick the NIV's translation of this verse apart. Your English translations are, for the most part, extremely trustworthy, excellent translations. The vast majority of them are, including the NIV most of the time. Whenever we do these kind of things where we talk about, hey, this isn't really what this means in the original language, I never want to give the impression that you can't trust your Bible or that there's no point reading the Bible if you don't know Greek and Hebrew. That's not the case. Your English translations are excellent and reliable, some more than others. But for the most part, the NIV is solid, especially the newer version. But I will say, every once in a while, translators get something wrong in ways that are misleading. And in my opinion, the 80s version of the NIV, their translation of this verse is just filled with problems. So don't take that as a blanket, dismissal of that entire translation. But this verse has some problems. So before we even get to that, right off the bat, something we talk about a lot when we talk about the Bible is this: for I know the plans I have for you. English doesn't have a second person plural pronoun. And so every time we see the word you, we are prone to think of that in an individualistic sense, especially because as Western people, we are incredibly individualistic folks. And the ancient world, and frankly, the Eastern world, and even now today, is much more collectivist than we are. And so we're all about us and our kind of individual autonomy. The Eastern world and the ancient world was much more about the good of your family, the good of your tribe, the good of your people. And so that's reflected both in the translation here, which again, this one's not their fault. It says you, but it's not a singular you. The Hebrew there is plural. So it's, I know the plans I have for all y'all. We've talked about that before, how people from the South are the only people who have a second person plural in English. So I know the plans I have for y'all. So right off the bat, God is not saying to you, the person reading the verse, that he knows the plans he has for you. He is telling Israel that he knows the plans he has for all of them collectively as a people. And in the ancient world, again, because you're a collective family-based society, this is not as bad of news as it sounds like. I believe that the faithful 55-year-old Jewish man hears Jeremiah's prophecy and doesn't react with like, well, I'm not going to be blessed, so who cares? What a bunch of crap this is. No, I think that person would think, praise God, my children will see a return to Jerusalem. And because he's thinking more on the level of his entire people and his entire family, that's not going to be this kind of horrifically disturbing message. Now, problem number 2 is a bigger problem, and it has to do with the mess that's going on in the second sentence. Prosper is problem number 1. Plans to prosper you. The English word prosper to us, we associate it primarily with material wealth and material security. Prosperity and to prosper for us means that you do well in the material world. You have plenty of money, plenty of food, plenty of resources. But that is not what this word means in Hebrew. And so it's a misleading translation. The word there in Hebrew is shalom, which is a very, very common word, a very powerful word in the Hebrew mind and in the Hebrew Bible. It means peace. And it means more than just peace, because we've talked about this in church before, but in English, the word peace just means the absence of conflict. But the Hebrew word shalom goes beyond that, and it's making a positive statement. It's saying a state of harmony and equilibrium, of everything working the way it's supposed to work. So it's like super peace. It's not prosperity, it's peace. And then this word harm is the Hebrew word ra'ah, which can be translated evil or bad or disaster. But that's only the beginning of the problem here. So already it's about peace and harmony, not about prosperity. But the bigger problem is these are both being translated here, if we can get super nerdy for a second, as infinitive verbs. To prosper is an infinitive verb. And then they supply the subject you, which is not there at all in Hebrew. And in fact, the word shalom isn't even a verb in this sentence. So hopefully you're tracking with me. Here's what I'm saying. In English, we make it a verb, to prosper you. And all that's there in Hebrew is the noun shalom. And that's true also with the second one. It's not to harm you, it's the noun ra'ah, evil or disaster. So watch, this is what's crazy. This is one of those examples. This verse is so famous in the NIV that we have this version embedded in our brains, but look at what the ESV says. The ESV translation of Jeremiah 29:11 is, I know the plans I have for you, declares Yahweh, plans for welfare and not for evil. That's way, way closer to what's there in Hebrew. Not plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans for welfare and not for evil. Nouns. Let's look. We can look at one more. We'll take a look at the NASB, which is like a very literal, direct translation. In Jeremiah 29:11, for I know the plans that I have for you, declares Yahweh, plans for welfare and not for calamity, to give all y'all a future and a hope. So hopefully that's clear, because here's the difference. In Hebrew, this verse doesn't even say, not even at all, that I have plans to prosper you, and I have plans not to harm you. God says, I know the plans I have for all of you, Israel, and they are plans for peace and welfare, not for disaster and calamity. And so, again, if you are somebody who's focused on God's promises to your people, that's incredibly good news. The message is, hey, you've got 70 more years of this coming up, but God's promise to you to give you peace, to give you freedom from calamity and disaster and bloodshed and war, those promises still stand. God will keep those. He hasn't abandoned you, even though he could, because of your covenant violations. You have committed adultery against your husband, and he has chosen to take you back anyway. That's the message here. And so the promise is beautiful. And again, I'm convinced that the faithful Jewish listener to this wouldn't say, well, what the heck? I'm not even going to be alive when that happens. I think that the faithful listener would have said, God has not abandoned his people. Our children and our children's children will have peace once again in the land that God promised to our father Abraham. I think that's what the reaction would be. So, okay, that was pretty nerdy. Hopefully you guys are with me. Everybody okay? Any questions before we move on? Because I've got a few more things to say here. Because we haven't really answered the question of what does this verse mean for me as a modern Christian, right? Let me just jump in here. Give you guys a second if you have any questions or stuff you want to throw in here. So Israel's identity begins with the calling of Abraham, who I just referenced. Genesis 12, we've talked about it a bunch. But he's this person to whom God makes a promise. Your offspring are going to become a nation, and I'm going to bless all the nations of earth through your family. That's a promise God makes to Abraham. And that's a promise he is going to keep no matter what Abraham or his offspring do. Now, that kind of, hundreds of years go by. The promise to give him offspring and turn them into a nation comes true. Everything keeps building and building and building. God, after he rescues his people from Egypt, makes another covenant through Moses with the entire people at Sinai. It's saying a bunch of stuff. It's way more complicated, but that detail is still in there. He wants to make them a kingdom of priests and a holy nation, the nation through whom he fulfills his promise to Abraham to bless all the nations of earth. Now, they fail to uphold their end of the covenant. That's why they end up in Babylon. But through prophets like Jeremiah, there's another covenant in the midst of that also, where King David is told by God that your offspring, a person from your line, David, is going to sit the throne of Israel forever and reign over Israel and subsequently the rest of the world. And so again, Israel fails and things get darker, darker, darker until they end up in exile in Babylon. But through the prophets like Jeremiah and Isaiah and others, God continues to promise that he's going to rescue them, that he's going to keep his promises to Abraham, to David, to Israel. He's going to do what he said he was going to do. And so Jeremiah's high point in this regard comes in chapter 31, which is just a couple chapters after Jeremiah 29, right? And he says this. It's an incredibly famous passage about the new covenant. Actually, let's jump a little farther in because it's towards the end. 31. Yeah. So this is another prophecy from Jeremiah. Behold, the days are coming, declares Yahweh, when I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and the house of Judah, not like the covenant that I made with their fathers on the day that I took them by the hand to bring them out of the land of Egypt, my covenant that they broke, though I was their husband, declares Yahweh. So hopefully you're seeing some of what I just described right there in this moment. He's saying, the covenant that I made at Sinai through Moses, I'm going to make a new one that won't be the same as that one. It won't be like that one. They broke that one. And he says, this is the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel after those days, declares Yahweh. I will put my law within them, and I will write it on their hearts, and I will be their God, and they will be my people. And no longer shall each one teach his neighbor and each his brother, saying, Know Yahweh, for they shall all know me, from the least of them to the greatest, declares Yahweh. And here's the kicker. For I will forgive their iniquity, and I will remember their sin no more. And there's mysterious kind of rumblings all throughout the prophets of how God is going to do this idea of forgiving their iniquity and not remembering their sin anymore. What is God going to do to make this possible? And you get these visions of a Messiah character who's, maybe it's the son of David that was promised to David, but someone is going to make this possible. And of course, as Christians, we believe that in Jesus, this new covenant comes about, is ushered in. God, through Jesus, keeps his promise to Abraham that one of his offspring will bless all the nations of the world. He keeps his promise to David that someone from his line will sit the throne forever. And he keeps his promise to Israel that through Israel, all of the nations are going to be blessed. And so that's why Paul can say, in more places than this, but here's the famous one, all the promises of God find their yes in him. And that is why it is through him that we utter our amen to God for his glory. So we, as Christians, through Christ, become recipients of God's promises to Abraham and others. We become offspring of Abraham, brought into that through the work of Jesus. And that's, again, what God promised Abraham 2,000 years before Jesus was even born. And so, to return to that question, the question we started with, does Jeremiah 29:11 apply to me as a 21st century Gentile Christian? It's a promise that God made to Israel in exile. What does it apply to me? And the answer is yes. Yes. Just not in the way that we usually talk about it. It doesn't mean, that when I'm having a bad day, God has promised not to harm me and he's promised to prosper me. So if I have faith, he'll pull me out of that. That's not how it applies to me. It is infinitely more glorious than that. Infinitely more glorious than we typically make it. It's not just the promise of getting you through a tough day or even getting you through a really horrible situation that you're in the middle of. It's a promise for shalom for all eternity through the finished work of Jesus. That the promises that God made to Abraham and to Israel and to David are coming true in and through Jesus. And you and I, even as Gentiles, can be brought in because of his work at the cross. And so it's a promise that we, like Israel, cling to in the midst of suffering. We don't look at that promise and say, hey, God guaranteed that he'd get me out of this. No, we say God has promised that in the end, all will be made right. And we will have shalom and freedom from calamity forever. A promise of shalom and no ra'ah that will last for all of eternity. And so we have in the New Testament, actually, let's look at one. The New Testament makes it clear we have a lot in common spiritually with the exiled Israelites. The author of Hebrews, after he goes through this giant list of faithful Old Covenant followers of God, people like Abraham and others, and talks about how they believed in God for promises that wouldn't even come true in their lifetime. And then at the end, he says, these all of these characters died in faith, not having received the things promised, but having seen them and greeted them from afar, and having acknowledged that they were strangers and exiles on the earth. For people who speak thus make it clear that they are seeking a homeland. If they had been thinking of that land from which they had gone out, they would have had opportunity to return. But as it is, they desire a better country, that is, a heavenly one. Therefore God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared for them a city. So there's this idea here that we, like them, we're exiles here on earth. And Peter says similar stuff in 1 Peter. But God has promised a city. God has promised you citizenship. And that's the thing you cling to, not because it's going to deliver you from suffering right this second, but because even in the midst of suffering, you have that promise and that hope. And it's hope that makes suffering bearable. The true Christian hope is long-term. It's not that suffering will not last. In fact, a quote that I read this week from David Platt, who's a missiologist and pastor who I love, he says, when suffering comes, sometimes suffering stays. And I think that's so important for Christians to realize. I mean, think about the first followers of Jesus, the apostles, and how many of their lives go really, really well in a material sense. I mean, the majority of those guys die young, penniless, and covered with scars from the beatings they receive. That's how their lives go. And that we're talking about the most faithful people in human history, people like Peter and Paul. And so when suffering comes, sometimes suffering stays. And we believe, of course, that it's entirely possible that God could deliver you from suffering. And we hope for that, and we pray for that, and we ask God for that. And by his grace, you might just receive that. But that is not promised in Scripture, that you will be removed immediately from the thing that you're dealing with right now. We ask for it, we pray for it, but the thing we lean on is the promise of God, which is that his plans are guaranteed to prevail in the end. And so that gives you the ability to weather it when your plans fall apart, when your dreams don't come true, when your suffering just seems to drag on and on and on. You put your hope in the fact that the God of resurrection has made promises that he is going to keep to you. And that in the end, all will be made right and shalom will be ushered in forever. God's plans are for your good and not for your harm, but not necessarily in this exact moment. And so I know, like I said at the beginning, that many of us are clinging to God for hope right now. And so the last thing I want to do is take a verse like Jeremiah 29:11 and say, nope, you don't get this hopeful one. I want us to see that the thing we hope in is so much bigger than what people normally make Jeremiah 29:11 about. And so I want to end with some words from Jesus, words from our faithful King who spoke to us about this stuff. And so in times like the ones we're in, I would just like to humbly encourage you to memorize maybe one or two of these Maybe let this be the thing that's on your computer background or on your coffee mug or on your, your reusable grocery bag. Because the truth is, Christians have every reason to hope and to trust in God. And we just want to do that rightly in a way that's faithful to what he has actually promised us. So here are some of the most profoundly beautiful and hope-filled things that Jesus has promised us and told us. It's from John chapter 14. Let not your hearts be troubled. Believe in God, believe also in me. In my Father's house are many rooms. If it were not so, would I have told you that I go to prepare a place for you? And if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come again and will take you to myself, that where I am, you may be also. Now I just want to tell you, when you are suffering, these are words for you. The author of Hebrews says, the hope that we have is in a city that God has prepared for us, a heavenly country that we are citizens of. And here Jesus tells his first followers, and I believe by extension us, he's going to prepare a place for those who entrust themselves to him, and you're going to be there forever. That is ultimate security. And so, even if you do suffer long, you suffer with that knowledge. A couple chapters later, he says, I have said these things to you, that in me you may have peace. In the world you will have tribulation, but take heart. I have overcome the world. It's one of the most powerful verses in the entire Bible. And you notice it's not a guarantee of a life of ease. It's exactly the opposite of that. It's not a guarantee of a rescue from suffering. He says, actually, in this world, you are going to have tribulation. You're going to have hard times. There's going to be suffering, no question. But, and that but is like one of the most beautiful words in the entire Bible. Because he says, you're going to suffer, you're going to have tribulation, but listen, take courage, be courageous. That's what that means. I have overcome the world. So the tribulation and the suffering you have, it's temporary, and I have beaten it already on your behalf. And then these words that I think about all the time. This comes after the Great Commission in Matthew chapter 28. It says 29. That's a typo. It's 28. So he says, go therefore unto all nations, baptizing them, making disciples, teaching them to obey all I have commanded. And he says, and behold, I am with you always to the end of the age, into the eternal. And so, again, and hey, I promise that it won't be hard and that you won't struggle. No, he says, I will be with you in the midst of struggle. He's sending them out into, especially his first hearers, he's sending them out into the most difficult thing you could imagine. And what he says is not, and it won't be hard, don't worry, I'll make it easy. What he says is, I'll be with you. That's the promise. And then finally, at the literal end of the Bible, this is the second to last verse in the entire Bible, the last thing Jesus says in the pages of Scripture, he who testifies to these things says, surely I am coming soon. Amen. Come, Lord Jesus. So he says, I'm coming soon. And so here's the thing. When you struggle, when you suffer, when you are in the midst of pain and difficulty, which so many of us are right now, just because of the horrible situations unfolding all around us, Jesus is with you. Jesus is coming back like he said he would, and Jesus has promised that those who entrust themselves to him will live in peace and security with him for all eternity. That's the promise that we cling to. And that is so much better of a promise than a promise to deliver you from the suffering right now. Because the promise of presence with you in the midst of it and a future hope after it, man, incomparable. And so yes, Jeremiah 29:11 is about God blessing you. It is. And that's why it's oversimplistic to say, hey, Jeremiah 29:11 is not about you, Christian. That's an underdeveloped theology. Jeremiah 29:11 is about you as a Christian, just not in the way you think. It's infinitely better than the way we usually talk about it. So I want to finish with a quote from, it's a little small, hopefully you can read it, a guy named Russell Moore. He's just an excellent thinker and writer in the Christian world. He says, does Jeremiah 29:11 apply to you? If you are in Christ, you can count on it. The passage doesn't promise you the kind of future American culture prizes, and maybe even promises a future you would tremble at if you saw it in a crystal ball. Short term, you may suffer, but long term, your future is co-signed with Christ. That's a future for your welfare and not for evil, a future of hope and not of despair. So take heart. He has overcome the world, he is with you, and he is coming soon to right every wrong, wipe every tear, and bring in everlasting shalom for all who put their faith in him. And so hopefully that's encouraging to you. I think that if you understand this verse correctly, it's more encouraging, not less, especially for those of us who maybe have believed at different times in our lives that the reason we're still suffering is because we don't have enough faith to get ourselves out of the situation we're in. And you tell people too long that, hey, if you have enough faith, God promises he'll take you out of that situation, then man, when it doesn't happen, it's incredibly depressing. So I hope that helps. We're actually going to wrap up a little early tonight, which might be nice for some of you. But I can hang for a couple minutes if you guys have questions or thoughts. Ed and Dina Bless say, this is great. Love the context, historical background, and language lesson. Makes so much more sense. Thank you. You're welcome, and thank you, Dina. That sounds like it's written by Dina, so I'm going to say Dina. Yeah, no, you're welcome. And like I said, this is, it's good news. It's good news. I would rather believe that God is ushering in shalom for all eternity than that he's going to deliver me from this present struggle that I'm in. And if you talk, by the way, just as a side note, I'm a missions pastor. If you talk to people in really hard places to live, I'm talking about like my brothers in Cambodia and in rural East Africa and in Nigeria, the things that they hope for, the faithful ones, are eternal. It's, we can weather this now because God has promised us eternity with his son. And so, yeah, we need to get on that bandwagon because it's a better way to view our world and our future. So any other questions or thoughts? If not, I will jump into letting you guys know what's happening next. So, okay, here's what we're doing for the next month. It's going to be really cool. We're super excited. All but one of our apologists who are doing our guest video sermons and lectures, incredible people. I mean, world-renowned apologists, people like Hugh Ross and Greg Kokel. All of them except for our first speaker, Vince Vitale, who is incredibly busy. Every other one of them has agreed to come on and do a live Q&A with Isaac and I on Thursday nights. So for the month of August, after you hear our apologetic speaker on a Sunday, that Thursday, Isaac and I will be on with him live during our normal Theology Thursday time to ask him your guys' questions. So again, I'm talking about people like Hugh Ross and Greg Kokel. So you do not want to miss this. It's something you should absolutely be telling people about and inviting people to. And here's the way it's going to work. It's going to look just like this. Well, it won't look just like this. We're going to be in a different place and Isaac and I will be together. But the format will be like this. It'll be on YouTube Live and you'll be able to interact and ask questions live. But you can also send in your questions ahead of time by email. So you can send them to me, sam@svccchurch.com. I should have made a slide that said that. Watch this. I'll do it live. Yep. This makes for really great video content. You guys watching me do this. Add. Boom, look at that. Check it out, my email. So, yep, for those of you who are sticklers, that is 1, 2, 3 C's in the middle. South Valley Community Church, church.com. So please, if you watch the sermon and you have questions or you have thoughts, write down your questions. And my advice to you would be email them to me if you already know what they are. Because I don't know how many people are going to show up. I don't know how slammed it's going to be, and you have a much higher chance of having your question answered if I get it ahead of time than if you do it live. But of course, please show up and ask questions live. I think it's, Anaya says, I love this. That's so awesome. I love that you're watching. And Jill Dowler says, yay, spelled like hey. That must be a hip new thing to do. So this should be super, super cool, you guys. I'm really, really looking forward to it. Isaac and I have been kind of dealing with some of the technological issues to make it really good. And we're going to have him on Skype to answer your questions. So again, pay attention when you're watching on Sundays. Write down questions you have. Send me an email with your questions, and then show up live and interact and ask questions there too. I think it's going to be a really cool opportunity. We have these guys come every year who are just world-renowned apologists and speakers. And every year, truly, we have people who say, I wish we could ask questions after. And so this is an opportunity to do that. And our speakers have been incredibly gracious to give us that time. So please show up for that. Tell your friends and family about it. And yeah, we'll see you then. So next week, with that in mind, our first speaker, like I said, had scheduling conflicts and isn't available. Yep, Ellen's asking the question next week. So our first speaker has a conflict and isn't able to make it. So Isaac and I are going to kick the thing off by just the two of us hosting a Q&A about his content. So you can ask questions about what he spoke on, and Isaac and I will answer questions about that and kind of maybe develop some of those ideas a little bit further. So we'll still do a live Q&A with me and Isaac, kind of introducing that new format and then also answering any questions that you guys have about that content. So that's what we'll do next week. And then after that, we'll have our speakers, Jay Kim, Greg Kokel, Hugh Ross, all showing up to answer your questions. And if you've never before had an opportunity to ask one of the smartest people on the planet like Hugh Ross a question, don't miss it. Yeah, so that's that. Hopefully that sounds cool to you guys. Hopefully you'll be there for it. If there's no more questions, I think we will call it a night. As always, thank you guys all so much for being here. It's such a pleasure to get to do this with you guys live. Yeah, we'll see you next week with Isaac and I. God bless. Have a great night.